All right, so are millennials and Gen Z really worse off than baby boomers were? Whether you're getting ready for a big meeting today or just kind of fascinated by money stuff, you submitted this Humphrey Yang video, and we're going to deep dive into it.
Yeah, it's definitely a question that gets people fired up. There are tons of opinions out there, but we're going to stick to what Yang has to say in this video and, not pick any sides or anything.
Right, exactly. We're all about exploring here, not about taking sides. So Yang's video really digs into this question. Are millennials and Gen Z facing like a way tougher financial situation than boomers did back in the day? And he starts off by talking about housing.
Yeah, housing is always a big one.
Always.
It actually starts with this thing called the her price income ratio, which basically means how many years would you have to work to buy a typical house, at the median price. And when he compares 1988, when boomers were around 33, to 2022, when millennials hit that age, it's pretty shocking.
Yeah, so Yang says back in '88, a boomer would need about 4 years of their income to buy a home. But in 2022, a millennial would need more than 6 years. That's a huge difference.
It really is. And to give you an idea of just how big that is, the ratio we're seeing now is even higher than it was during the housing bubble, like back in 2006, 2008, which everyone thought was crazy high at the time. Yang also mentions that over in the UK, they've been dealing with ratios over 7 for more than a decade. And it even hit 9 recently. So it makes you wonder, is this a global thing or is it just happening in certain countries?
It does. I hadn't even thought about that. Yang actually uses some graphs to really show what's going on. One of them compares the typical household income, the median income, to home prices all the way back to the 50s. And around 2005, there's this crazy jump where home prices just take off while incomes kind of lag behind.
Yeah, and that graph makes you think about the long-term impact. Like if owning a home keeps getting harder and harder for younger generations, will they even be able to build wealth the way older generations did? I mean, owning a home has always been a big part of how people build wealth over time, so this trend could have a big impact.
You're making me rethink my own financial goals. Yang then shows a graph comparing home prices to inflation since 1970. You know, we all know houses usually cost more over time, more than just general inflation. But this graph shows that in the last 10 years or so, it's like a straight lineup, like almost vertical. It kind of freaks me out.
Yeah, it's a powerful way to show how big this gap is that Yang keeps talking about. Even if you take into account inflation, you need way more money to buy a house now than in the past. We're not just talking about numbers on a screen here. This is about real people and whether they can actually achieve their dreams. What are your thoughts on this? Does any of this sound familiar to you?
It does, absolutely. I mean, I see friends and family who are having a tough time getting into the housing market, and this really puts things into perspective. It also makes me wonder, why is there such a huge difference in affordability now?
Well, Yang tries to answer that question next. One thing he points out is that there's just more competition for housing now than there was for boomers back in like the 70s and 80s. Back then, the U.S. population was smaller, so there wasn't as much demand, which kept prices lower.
Yeah, makes sense. Basic supply and demand, right?
Right, and it shows how demographics can have a real effect on the economy. He also mentions that boomers tended to get married earlier, and a lot of times both spouses were working, so they had more money to buy a house. But now, millennials are waiting longer to get married, if they do at all, and that can affect how much they can afford.
He even mentions this stat from Pew Research Center. Only 55% of millennials are living with their own family, compared to 69% for Gen X and like 85% for the silent generation. Those are huge differences. So is the secret to financial success getting hitched early?
Well, not necessarily. You have to remember that just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean one causes the other. So, yeah, boomers did get married earlier and buy houses, but it doesn't mean those two things are directly connected. It could be other things like cultural stuff, the economy at the time, or how easy it was to find an affordable place to live.
Right, right. It's good to look at everything from different angles. So we've talked about how demographics contributing to this financial gap between generations.
Definitely. Yang talks about those next, and he starts with the elephant in the room, college.
Okay, so let's talk tuition. Yang shares some stats that are kind of scary. Like average tuition has more than doubled and student loan debt has tripled since the 90s. That's got to be a huge weight on anyone's shoulders, especially when you're just getting started.
It is, and it makes you think, is college even worth it anymore? Like, is that 4-year degree really as valuable as it used to be? Yang says that student loan debt is now at a crazy $1.7 trillion, and something like 7% of borrowers owe more than $100,000.
That's insane. I feel like Everyone tells young people they have to go to college to be successful, but then they graduate with tons of debt and can't find a job that pays enough. It's a no-win situation.
It really is, and that's why a lot of people are looking at other options like learning online, going to trade school, or even starting their own businesses. Those might be a better way to learn skills and get experience without going broke. What do you think? Is college still a must-have, or are there other paths to success?
Hmm, that's a tough one. I think it really depends on your goals and what kind of job you want. I know people who've done great without a college degree and others who went to college and still struggled. I don't think there's one right answer for everyone anymore.
I agree. You have to find what works for you and be ready to adapt, because things are changing all the time.
And speaking of changing, Yang doesn't shy away from talking about another painful topic, car prices. Apparently, the average car payment now is like $716 a month, and people are taking out loans for almost 6 years on average.
That's crazy. And a lot of these car loans have really high interest rates, which just makes things worse. It's all part of this trend where people are borrowing more and more money, not just for cars, but also credit cards and stuff. And that can really limit your options and make it hard to save or invest for the future.
So we've covered a lot, and it's starting to feel a little bit doom and gloom. But Yang doesn't just leave us hanging. He gives some advice on how to deal with all this, starting with how to manage your spending and make things more affordable. He talks about the 30% rule for rent and mortgage payments.
The 30% rule, right, which means you shouldn't spend more than 30% of your income on housing. But let's be real, that can be super hard in some places, especially in those big, expensive cities Yang talked about. I think the point is to be aware of how much you're spending and make a budget that works for you, even if you go over that 30% sometimes.
Yeah, it's about being realistic and not getting too hung up on that specific number.
Right, you got to be flexible.
Totally. And along with watching your spending, Yang says it's important to pay off your debts, especially the ones with high interest rates like credit cards. That way you have more money to work with. He even suggests trying other ways to get around, like biking or taking public transit so you can save on car expenses.
Those are all good practical tips that can make a big difference. Little things can add up over time.
It's easy to get overwhelmed by the big picture, but it's helpful that Yang gives us concrete steps we can take. And it's not all bad news. He also reminds us that investing can really help even if you don't have a lot to invest. And the earlier you start, the better because of compound growth. He gives some great examples of how even putting a little bit of money into a Roth IRA every month can turn into a lot of savings over time.
Yeah, that's the power of compounding.
Yeah.
He says if you put in like $250 a month into a Roth IRA and the market does okay, you could end up with almost $1 million after 40 years.
Wow, that's amazing. It shows that even small efforts can really pay off down the line. Time is really on your side when it comes to building wealth.
Absolutely. It's not about getting rich quick. It's about thinking long term and making smart choices that'll benefit you in the future.
So true. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are your thoughts so far? What's really stood out to you in this conversation about generational finances?
Well, it really makes you think Like, we see how money and finances have changed so much over time, and now it's way harder for young people to afford a place to live. But it's not just the numbers themselves, it's also about how all these things connect. Demographics, societal shifts, economic forces. It's all there in what Yang's saying.
Yeah, totally. It's like this huge tangled web of factors, and we need to understand how they all fit together if we want to find any solutions. I always like a good story, and Yang told this one about his friends out in Silicon Valley who switched jobs like every other year just to make more money. That really stuck with me. It seems like a totally different world out there.
It is a pretty common thing in certain industries, actually, especially in those fast-paced competitive fields like tech. I mean, it does make you wonder about things like work-life balance and whether people are actually happy with their careers. But it also shows you that you got to be on top of your game and know how to manage your career, especially these days when things are changing so fast. The days of staying at one company forever are over.
For sure. A lot of my friends are job hopping too, and while Yang doesn't say you should just chase money and forget about everything else, he does suggest that people ask themselves if their job is actually helping them reach their financial goals and, if it's good for their overall well-being. That really hit home for me.
Yeah, it's a good point. We all have to make choices, and sometimes those choices are tough. The important thing is to really think about what you're doing and weigh all the options.
Totally. Speaking of choices, Yang goes into some pretty crazy details about student loans. Like seeing how the average debt has tripled since the 90s is kind of scary.
It really is. It shows just how expensive education has gotten and how much of a burden it can be for young people. It also brings up some big questions about whether a college degree is even worth it anymore. Like, is it still the golden ticket everyone says it is, or are there other ways to get ahead?
It's a good question. We're seeing more and more people turning to things like online learning, trade schools, and even starting their own businesses. Yang even mentioned that the number of people graduating from college has gone up like 250% since 1970. That's a lot of new graduates all trying to find jobs.
It's a huge increase, which can make it harder to find a good job and maybe even push salaries down in certain fields. It's not about telling people not to go to college, but more about encouraging them to really think about their goals and what they want to do. What do you think about all this? Did you ever consider doing something besides the traditional four-year college route?
Actually, yeah, I took some online courses before I got into podcasting. I found them really helpful, a good way to learn new skills at my own pace. I definitely recommend them, especially if you're worried about the cost of a regular degree.
I'm glad you had a good experience with online learning. It's becoming more and more popular, and it's a great way to learn new things.
And while we're talking about real-world economics, Yang also talks about how a lot of young people are taking out high-interest car loans, which can really hurt them financially.
It's a worrying trend that's happening with all kinds of debt. I mean,
Hmm.
credit cards can be helpful in a pinch, but they can also get you into a lot of trouble if you're not careful. That's why it's so important to learn how to manage your money responsibly.
Exactly. It's not just about making money, it's also about knowing how to use it wisely. It's like learning a new language.
Couldn't agree more. When you're financially savvy, you can make better decisions, avoid common mistakes, and really take control of your money.
And I like how Yang gives us practical advice alongside all the data. Like he says to keep your car payment below 10% of your monthly income and pay off your debts as fast as you can.
Those are really good tips that can help people avoid getting into a debt spiral.
It's easy to focus on the stats and numbers, but it's important to remember that those numbers represent real people who are trying to make ends meet and build a good life.
Absolutely. These financial problems can have a real impact on people's lives.
And while Yang doesn't sugarcoat the difficulties that younger generations are facing, he also reminds us that we can do something about it. Like, even investing small amounts can make a difference, especially if you start early and take advantage of compound growth. He talks about how even putting a little bit into a Roth IRA every month can add up over time.
Right. Even small steps can lead to big results in the long run.
It's a good reminder that we all have the power to change our financial situation no matter where we're starting from.
Exactly. It's about taking small steps, learning about money, and sticking with your goals.
So we've looked at a lot of data and talked about the challenges and opportunities facing different generations. What are your biggest takeaways so far?
It's really the big picture stuff that I keep thinking about, like all these differences in wealth between generations. How's that going to affect our future? Will things even out, or will it just get worse? I mean, it makes you think about all sorts of things like home ownership, starting businesses, even how involved people are in politics.
Right. It's not just about each person's money. It's about society as a whole. Like, if young people can't afford to buy homes, is that going to change what kind of houses people want? Will it even affect how much houses are worth overall?
It could, yeah. And what about how we all get along? I mean, if young people keep struggling with money, could that lead to, like, social unrest or more division in politics? Who knows what could happen down the line?
It's kind of scary to think about, honestly. But I guess that's why we do these deep dives, right? To try and understand these complicated issues and maybe find some answers. It's better to know what's going on than just ignore it.
Definitely. Information is power, right? And by having these conversations, we can start to figure out how to deal with these problems. Maybe it means changing how we think about home ownership or teaching people more about money or making sure everyone has equal chances to get a good education and a good job.
I'm all for that. It's easy to blame young people for their financial struggles, but it's obvious that there are bigger things going on that we need to fix.
You got it. It's about understanding that this is a mix of history, economics, and individual choices. And in the end, it's about working together to create a society where everyone has the chance to succeed financially.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of information in this deep dive. What's the one big takeaway you want to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think the main message is that even though things might look tough, especially for younger people, it's not hopeless. By understanding the challenges, managing their money proactively, and pushing for changes in the system, people can take control of their financial future.
I love that. And I want to add that this conversation doesn't end here. Keep talking about these issues, connect with other people who are going through the same things, and let's all work together to build a better future for every generation. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and until next time, keep learning and exploring.